Let's officially start. So welcome everyone to today's panel. This is our panel, Brainwashed, the Legacies and Perils of American Sinophobia. And it's hosted here in Colorado College. And I first want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists for finding time to share with us their current thinking, research, analysis. I also want to say thank you to our sponsors. I want to thank CC, Colorado College History Department, Political Science Department, Psychology Department, Race, Ethnicity, and Migration Studies program. I want to thank the Made in China Journal, as well as the Critical China Scholar. So thank you to all the sponsors for making this happen. I know you all want to hear from our 5 experts in the panel as soon as possible. So I'm going to keep the introductions very short. I do want you to join me in a land acknowledgement to recognize that we, Colorado College here as a host of the webinar in Colorado, that we learn, teach, and live on or near the ancestral homelands of a lot of indigenous communities of the Apache, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Pueblo, the Shoshone, and the Ute peoples. And actually right now here at Colorado College at this moment, we are situated specifically on the traditional territories of the Southern Ute Nation and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, as well as the Northern Ute peoples. We also have friends here on the panel joining us from Tennessee State University, Georgia State University, and University of California at Irvine. And so we also are therefore virtually at the homelands of the Ute, the Shawnee, Cherokee, Choctaw, the Tongva, Kizh people, and the Muskogee and Creek peoples. And I want to invite you to join us to acknowledge these indigenous connections, as well as histories of dispossession and forced removals that made allow for the possibility for the growth and survival of these current institutions that we're in. And it's important for us to pause and recognize these indigenous connections and histories so that we can pledge to strive to respect all peoples, continue to work towards equity and justice. So thank you for joining me with this brief land acknowledgement. I want to again, keep most of the time for the panelists. The format, I want to give you a quick idea of the format. So we have 5 panelists. Each of them will speak for about 8 minutes, and I'll keep track of time, and I'll do a good job as a moderator to keep track of time so that we leave time at the end for you all audience to share questions with us. If you have questions, please submit it through the Zoom chat. And I also know that some of you are watching through a direct live stream outside of the Zoom environment. And so for those of you who have questions, you can't get into us on Zoom, feel free to email us. Email me on echan, E-C-H-A-N, at coloradocollege.edu, and I'll scan those questions and try to get them to our panelists at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking today. John Williams over here. Hi, wave, John.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Yep. Is Associate Professor of History at Colorado College. Next to speak will be Christian Sorace. Christian is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Colorado College. Next to speak will be Keisha Brown. And Keisha is an Assistant Professor of History at Tennessee State University in the Department of History, Political Science, Geography, and Africana Studies. And next to speak is Maria Repnikova. And Maria is an assistant professor in global communications at Georgia State University, and she's also the director of the Center for Global Information Studies. Joining us in a little bit, she's not logged on yet, is Professor Catherine Liu, and she's Professor of Film and Media Studies at University of California, Irvine. So she'll join us shortly, but maybe, John, are you ready to help us get started?
Absolutely.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Emily. Let's see here. Sinophobia, as many of you know, means a fear of China or things Chinese. It's an Orientalist discourse with a long history. My remarks today concern that history and how it shapes contemporary perceptions. I should add that the images I will use to illustrate this history are offensive, and I apologize for any discomfort they may cause. So a very rough periodization of American Sinophobia might look something like this. Begins in the 19th century with the racism of the exclusion era, and continues through the early 20th century and on. In the 1930s and 40s, in the Depression and World War II, there's a brief hiatus in anti-China rhetoric. From the 1950s to the present, Cold War anti-communism magnifies this rhetoric. And in the 2000s, fear of China's rise to great power status actually amplifies it even further. I'll focus today on the first period to show how the basic premises of Sinophobia remain intact. Though there are obvious implications for Sino-US relations, my remarks are meant to address the domestic context and the impact of anti-China rhetoric on Asian Americans and Chinese citizens living in the US. A recent report showed that 80% of Asian American youth are angry about incidents of harassment. Adults were present for half of more than 300 episodes that were cited in this report, but those adults intervened only 10% of the time. Most of these cases involved rhetoric blaming China and/or Chinese people for the COVID-19 virus, ascribing it to racial or cultural traits. These themes actually don't begin with COVID or even SARS. They in fact have a long cultural pedigree, one that acts as source code for a response replayed in playgrounds and televisions across the country. That source code has been called yellow parallelism, a term that was coined in 1895 by Kaiser Wilhelm II in reference to a vision he had of such importance that he commissioned artist Hermann Nachfuss to illustrate it, as you see here. So I'd like you to note the graphic signifiers of civilizational threat in this image. Light versus darkness, a sunlit cross versus a Buddha nestled in a dark roiling storm. White European femininity threatened by the ominous advance of distant faceless hordes. Now I should add that the context for this dire vision was a bit more prosaic. It was Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War, which had aroused the Kaiser's fear that Germany might lose out in the continuing grab for Chinese territory. We can think of American Sinophobia as a homegrown strain of yellow parallelism that emerged when Chinese migrants came to the US to engage in mining, railroad building, and the agricultural labor that was necessary to transform arid California landscapes into farmland. White miners, workers, and municipal authorities responded with a racial hostility that echoes in the anti-Asian response to COVID, as this poster from 1881 shows. Note the themes: filth, immorality, disease, ruin to white labor, all tightly packed in yet another gendered image. These campaigns resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the only law ever designed to prevent a single ethnic group from entering the US. The association of Chinese laborers with disease claimed as its evidence the crowded and unsanitary conditions of places like San Francisco's Chinatown. But what exclusionists failed to acknowledge was that city authorities forbade Chinese migrants to live outside these enclaves and refused to provide them with basic municipal services. If Chinese communities were crowded or dirty, in other words, it was a direct result of anti-Chinese racism, not the cultural traits that were assigned to them. This pamphlet was issued by the American Federation of Labor in 1902. Asking whether American manhood or Asiatic coolieism would prevail, it portrayed the migrants as a menace to American civilization itself. The themes deployed in this campaign were both durable and portable. The idea that certain immigrants, and not others, threatened both jobs and the American way of life remain the rhetorical infrastructure for current anti-immigration sentiment and policies. As this recent survey shows from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, fear of China has become a partisan issue. But it's important to recognize that anti-Chinese fear has deep roots in the American left, as the AFL pamphlet demonstrates, and that its core premises often go unchallenged by liberals. Biden's reference to China's art of the steal links Trump's dishonesty to another hoary old trope of anti-Chinese stereotype, sneakiness and cheating. And this rhetorical strategy shares the same fundamental assumptions as the right's attempt to link the Chinese government with Black Lives Matter, something you will hear about momentarily. It goes like this: if you want to discredit your opponent, link them to China. Such rhetoric has consequences. In the 19th century, it aided and abetted violence against Chinese communities across the West. Pogroms in 1871 in Los Angeles, in 1885 in Wyoming, and Seattle in 1886 left scores dead, more injured, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property damaged or destroyed. And these were just three of but many incidents from the era. Exclusion laws did not result in the expulsion of negative Chinese stereotypes. Saxe-Rohmer's Fu Manchu, introduced in 1913, raised them to iconic status in literature and film. Now, the 1930s and 40s brought a shift in American perceptions. Pearl Buck's Good Earth portrayed the travails of Chinese farmers in a way that Dust Bowl era Americans could relate to, offering the commonsensical but somehow radical idea that maybe Americans and Chinese weren't that different after all. World War II made China and the United States allies, and Frank Capra lent his filmmaking talent to positive portrayals of China. Now, I don't claim that these portrayals are not Orientalist, and the lead roles in the film version of The Good Earth, for example, were portrayed by white actors in yellowface. But what I'm saying is that these narratives did not present that narrative of civilizational threat. That narrative was easily transferred to Japan. Chinese families in America anxiously hung ROC flags from their homes to avoid being mistaken for neighbors of Japanese descent who were being packed off to internment camps. That phenomena, unfortunately, serves to remind us again of the link between anti-Chinese sentiment and anti-Asian racism in general, its tropes of racial and civilizational threat, and how easily they can be transferred from one group to another. In April, State Department official Karan Skinner said that the Soviet-US rivalry was, quote, in a way, a fight within the Western family. It's the first time that we will have a great power competitor that is not Caucasian, end quote. Her comment both exposes the racialized foundations of contemporary xenophobic rhetoric, as well as an astounding historical myopia. The first non-white great power competitor was in fact Japan, and that conflict resulted in the mass incarceration of people of Japanese descent here in America. So though this kind of thinking predates China's 1949 revolution, the Cold War resurrected these threatening stereotypes and amplified them with an anti-Asian, anti-communist bullhorn, I should say. By the 1980s, Japan's economic transformation and industrial growth once again made it an object of fear. Pundits sounded the alarm bell for a Pacific century in which Japan would be leader, siphoning off American jobs and prosperity. In 1982, the killing of Chinese-American Vincent Chin by auto workers who took him for Japanese showed how murderous this particular flavor of anti-Asian race prejudice is. The current climate creates the possibility for incidents like this, and that is why this rhetoric is so dangerous. I close with this admonition from two scholars of yellow parallelism whose work you will find in our list of resources. Recurrent fear becomes naturalized like the bogeyman, imminent injury or death. It becomes systematic, a part of a political culture of daily life. It becomes yellow parallelism, a way of believing, a way of living. It also, I should add, creates a climate of fear for Asian Americans and for international students from China who have done so much to enrich our classrooms and campuses. They promote Sino-American cooperation on a daily basis in ways that are seldom recognized. They all deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And Christian, are you ready to pull up your?
I am almost ready. Let me just share the screen. Okay, share. Does that, oops. Okay.
Yep, that's working beautifully.
Okay, let me just full screen. Okay, I'm ready. Okay.
Thank you, go for it.
Thank you so much, John. Okay. The future of the United States is wide open, and how we act now will have enduring consequences. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed deep flaws in American society: a democracy unresponsive to the people, a healthcare system unprepared to address a public health crisis, and an economic system in which a missed paycheck for most Americans means not being able to pay rent or buy food. But amidst all of the horror, there is cause for optimism. Black Lives Matter, the largest social movement and uprising in US history, is courageously confronting the past and demanding change that would have been unthinkable months ago. There is also a rediscovery of socialism, especially among millennials who desire a future not mired in debt, a future in which there is still a planet. If democracy means anything today, it means seizing these possibilities that swirl before us. So it may seem odd at this very moment that we are hearing that the American way of life, quote unquote, is under threat and that Chinese communism is to blame. Although the Republicans are explicit and shameless in their xenophobia and fear-mongering, the Democrats also play a role in propagating the myth of a Red Scare and specter of Chinese communism haunting the heartland. Today, I will show how anti-communist discourse shifts attention away from the political, economic, and social crises facing the US and has very little to do with what is actually happening in China, which is a separate conversation. I will first look at how the Trump administration has blamed their own disastrous handling of the pandemic on China, after which I will discuss the more widely shared belief that the US is engaged in ideological warfare against Chinese communism. Spoiler alert, the real problem is China's status as a global capitalist power and has absolutely zero to do with communism. By now, I think it is obvious to most people that the Trump administration is desperate to shift attention away from their own ineptitude and disregard for the lives of ordinary American and non-Americans, anybody in the US. So I don't think I need to add much here other than I'll share some examples which speak for themselves. Oops, okay. Here is a tweet from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo insinuating that the reason your freedom is being restricted and you have to wear a mask is because of China. The verb unleashed insinuates that China is engaging in biowarfare, a narrative also peddled by fringe right-wing conspiracy theorists. In this tweet, Senator Kelly Loeffler blames the president's coronavirus on China when it was clearly the result of his own arrogance and recklessness. This is the senator who sold at least 18 million in stocks after an intelligence briefing on the virus. Here is Representative Mark Walker crying election interference. In this tweet, we can see the anticipation of Trump's probable loss in November and the need to find a scapegoat, similar to how Democrats have fixated on Russian interference to avoid confronting their own failures in 2016. This tweet wins the prize for the most absurd. And this tweet, as Tobita Chow from Justices Global has pointed out on Twitter, Senator Blackburn's tweet locating the body and the health of the nation in the body of the leader is an unmistakable example of fascist rhetoric. Then there is Senator Josh Hawley's publicity stunt demanding reparations from China, and the Li Wenliang Global Public Health Accountability Act of 2020, introduced by Senator Tom Cotton, who is also the author of the New York Times op-ed that called on the president to invoke the Insurrection Act and quote unquote send in the troops to quash the Black Lives Matter protests. The act also co-sponsored by Ted Yoho, who is most well known for calling AOC a fucking bitch on the steps of the Capitol Hill, among other Republicans. This act would, quote, authorize the president to impose sanctions on foreign officials who suppress or distort information about a public health emergency of international concern, end quote. One wonders if that logic would have been applied to the Reagan administration's abhorrent response to the AIDS epidemic, or to Trump's constant stream of misinformation regarding the severity of the coronavirus. It is also worth mentioning that Dr. Li Wenliang, the namesake of the act and whistleblower who died from the coronavirus after being detained by local authorities in Wuhan, also happened to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party, which would mean that he would have been banned under the new ruling that prohibits CCP members from immigrating to the US. But such complexity does not fit the narrative of a Manichaean struggle of good versus evil. Although they part ways in how they discuss the pandemic, both Republicans and Democrats are invested in conjuring up the specter of a communist enemy against which the US can assert itself as a defender of freedom and democracy. A glaring problem with this argument is that the Communist Party is not by any stretch of the imagination communist, and the US is not really democratic either. In a report recently published by the All-Republican China Task Force, we are warned that China's, quote, hostile communist ideology threatens and affects the lives of every American, end quote. The first chapter of the report, titled Ideological Competition, argues that, quote, communist ideology dictates the CCP's every decision and action, end quote. To be clear, the report is arguing that the second largest economy of global capitalism is motivated by communist ideology. The authors don't see the contradiction between the second chapter's focus on China's role in the global supply chain and the assertion of a communist China. But blaming China is easier than analyzing the contradictions of global capitalism. Just look at what happened to poor Bernie. So if China isn't remotely communist, what can explain the fevered insistence that it is? And here we get to the core of my argument, that the script of anti-communism is recited as soon as people start to sense that things could be otherwise. The US needs China as its antithesis so that it can appear to itself as the defender of democracy without actually undergoing democratic transformation. It is symptomatic how the task force report interchangeably uses terms like democracy, freedom, and the American way of life, ignoring the fact that the American way of life has excluded the humanity of Black people and many others. And I can't even say until recently, because that would imply that racism is over. The description here, this description of American freedom battling against Chinese totalitarianism in an epic struggle over the future sounds a lot like the script of a John Wayne movie being repackaged and marketed as political analysis. Because what is a hero without an arch nemesis? And how would US democracy look without its totalitarian other? In Pompeo's speech, Communist China and the free world's future, the closest Pompeo gets to defining freedom is the following tautology, quote, I have faith we can defend freedom because of the sweet appeal of freedom itself, end quote. Besides being empty, Pompeo's references to freedom are entirely disingenuous. Pompeo is not defending the intellectual freedom to subject national history to critical scrutiny, nor is he praising the freedom to protest state violence and demand that Black Lives Matter. In fact, he defines all of the above as a threat to the American way of life, which for him is synonymous with freedom. Ergo, in June, he asked the US Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, to take down a Black Lives Matter banner because it upset him. When interviewed about the BLM protests, Pompeo described them as, quote, a dark vision of America's birth. I reject it. It is a disturbed reading of history. It is a slander on our great people. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Chinese Communist Party must be gleeful when they see the New York Times spout their ideology, end quote. In Pompeo's universe, China is the vector both of the coronavirus and, in his words, quote, a virulent strain of communism, end quote, which good, innocent, freedom-loving Americans need to guard against. What Pompeo's speech actually reveals is the double helix structure of racism and anti-communism that constitutes the American way of life. For this reason, defeating Trump in November, while important, cannot be the horizon of progressive politics, which is also why the Biden campaign's promise of a return to normal is a fantasy that nothing needs to change. Although it is marketed as the antidote to Trump's toxicity, it is entirely inadequate to the situation ahead. Thank you. Oop, am I still?
Thank you, Christian. Yep.
Thanks.
I think your screen, yep, it got taken off. So thank you, Professor Williams and Professor Sorace, on really, these are my colleagues at Colorado College, right? So between the two and this team, they trace basically, the Sinophobia from century and a half ago to yesterday, right? I mean, I'd be curious what you all think about the current political campaigns and the debates, and we'll leave that question for the discussion. Now we're ready to invite Professor Keisha Brown, who will join us now to talk about marginalized history of Black and Chinese. Oh, is it working?
Yes. Can you see the screen?
Perfect. Yep,
Yes.
it's beautiful.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I think for me, the need to have this conversation was made more real this week when I actually had a chance to watch the VP debate with students from both Tennessee State University and Fisk University. We have a debate watch party for all the debates. And so seeing our students who attend historically Black colleges, universities, HBCUs here in the Southeast, it really kind of made a different impression on why conversations like today are so sorely needed. So today I'm doing a little bit different kind of conversation, and I'm thinking about the idea of comparative racialization and how in many cases this idea of using kind of an external scapegoat, as kind of Christian mentioned in terms of China as this kind of new boogeyman, but also thinking through internal scapegoats when thinking about the American fabric and thinking about that question of belonging. Thinking about who is part of the question of citizenship. And so this is an image. It is a source that in some ways I want you all to kind of in some ways absorb, analyze. And I'm going to zoom out in the next slide. But this is from an 1897 vaudeville song. It's the cover of the song. And the title is The Marriage Between the Chinese and the Coon. So let's sink in. Chinese and the Coon. And if we look in the ways in which the different individuals are depicted here, and thinking about the ways in which what is happening. So think about the image in connection to the context. 1897 was not too long after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. And it was not too far after the end of the Civil War, and it was during the midst of Reconstruction. And so we're thinking through the context of how we think about the question of belonging and questions of citizenship more broadly. How do we think about these particular questions of comparative racialization? So comparative racialization basically says how we use race in certain ways to where we're using race as a means of thinking through, in some ways, almost pitting groups against each other. What group belongs, what group doesn't, in the hopes of this kind of idea of fictive citizenship, this kind of dangling of a prize of citizenship at the end, which group deserves it and which group does not. And so I use references to books like Racial Reconstruction by Ed Wong, as well as books by The Chinese Must Go by Beth Lou Williams, as kind of a starting place for us to think about how in many cases this idea of comparative racialization has been a part of our American fabric. And unfortunately, how it has not gone away. It's just in some ways been new wine poured into old wine skins. And so thinking through this idea of kind of comparative racialization, I want us to kind of use this as a means to kind of interrogate and think through how we can move beyond this to think about potential comparative and new solidarities, new ways to align to in some ways combat some of the issues and problems that we're facing today. Comparative racialization is one I teach my students. And if I show them this picture, they are aghast. And in many cases, they focus on the kind of particular image they know of. They know how in many ways African Americans have been in some ways misrepresented, how in many ways the Black individual and the Black body has been targeted. But in many cases, they don't know about other minority groups in the same way. And I think this is a question that gets to in some ways, not just their own background understanding, but how we in some ways think about these questions more broadly as a society. How do we think about other ways other individual has been talked about, depicted, and understood as well? And to understand this, I think for them this moment, the kind of unfortunately the huge anti-Asian racism that has kind of been as a kind of a backlash of the kind of COVID-19, not just the virus itself, but also the horrible ways in which it has been misnamed, misidentified, has used all kind of slanderous terms by the current administration. And so this idea of finding someone to blame on top of the issues of systematic racism in this country have led to some new understandings. But I wanted to kind of think about this image from 1897 and thinking through how do we think about this particular topic and conversation at hand. And so this was a very vaudeville song, and the idea of vaudeville in this kind of context, exaggeration of Black features, exaggeration of Black face, the depiction of Black individuals outside of Black bodies. So it wasn't just Black performers, but in many cases, those who are non-Black actors who are putting on Black face, exaggerated lips, the red lips, the white teeth, the black face, the exaggerated features, in some ways to make this statement about how do we think through and how we think about the African-American individual post-emancipation, post the end of entitlement and chattel slavery and enslavement enslavement of a mass majority of African Americans in this country. And in thinking through this question, we also have the combination of the question of yellow peril. What was happening is the idea of, the idea of the Chinese individuals, the propaganda. They're too exotic to become American. They're too different. Why should they become citizens? And this question of how, in many cases, for both conversations, they're thinking through how to ship them out the country. Chinese Exclusion Act, they can't come in. The Back to Africa movements, ship them back to Africa. And so this question and thinking through who belongs and who doesn't gets me to think about, why do we have this particular conversation and why are we still having this conversation in the 2020 moment? This is not going away, unfortunately, and how we think the mixing between nationalism, nativism, and xenophobia, and how we see these mixing together to think through how people are still using the same model to in some ways pit different groups together, pit different groups against each other, and find a way to find some kind of scapegoating. We've seen this in conversations where different groups are trying to say that Black Lives Matter is a Chinese organization, they're getting funding, they're not American, when they're trying to fight for basic civil human rights, to try to fight for the ability of African Americans to go and actually do simple things or actually be able to live in their homes and not get shot and killed like Breonna Taylor. And so this question of thinking about whose lives matter and whose lives in some way are privileged gets to this question of how different models of, in some ways, thinking through comparative racialization have happened over the decades. And I think for me, the biggest point is that in many cases, the negative moments of encounters and interactions between African Americans and Asian Americans in the United States, we highlight the ones of tension. We highlight the murder of Latasha Harlins by a Korean store owner. We highlight the moments in which individuals are killed, but we don't highlight the moments of comparative kind of collaboration and solidarity. We don't highlight the ways in which in the 70s, students of African American and Asian American ancestry were coming together to be seen in the classroom through the creation of new curriculums and new programs, new departments that students today can benefit from. We don't see the collaborations between the moments when both parties, both groups are grieving, and they come together to grieve the lost individuals because they know how it feels to be singled out and killed for how you look and nothing else. And so I want us to think through, why do we in some ways focus on negative, think about the positive, and using that as a potential to build solidarities, thinking about the ways in which oppressive systems, economic, political, social, cultural, and other means have been able to oppress different groups in different ways. And in some ways, how we, in some ways, we are in some ways focused on how we each are impacted, that we don't see how the systems itself has multiple tentacles that we need to be able to cut off. And so I want us to be able to engage in a conversation about comparative racialization and think through how in some ways this is still happening and how we can combat these questions of thinking through the question of who belongs. Why are we in some ways putting up bans? Why do we have individuals in our country who are still in cages at the border? Why are we limiting the Chinese students and Chinese scholars and researchers from coming into the country to do work? Why are we in some way still saying that certain people matter and certain people don't? And I want us to kind of think through this question of, what do we mean by the American fabric? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be part of this kind of conversation? And how we can use this kind of thinking through this image. I know it's a very kind of stark and a very different way of thinking about it, but how we can in some ways negotiate, navigate, challenge, and dismantle some of the ways in which comparative racialization that we see here from an image in 1897 has not gone away, and how we need to still think about how we talk about these conversations, how we have those dialogues, how we move forward from this particular moment forward. So I think for me, I'm gonna stop right there. I think one of the lines that John has mentioned, I want to kind of rephrase it, where the idea of hate has been transferred from one group to another. And I see in many cases how this can happen over and over again, and how it does happen just between one group, but it can happen across the board, especially when we're talking about groups who are identified as people of color. So I'll stop. Emily popped up, so I'm gonna stop. I think that means my time is up. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Brown. It is a really important piece of perspective, right? That now we add the third lens to it to think about this important phenomenon of comparative racialization. So without more commentary, I'd like us to bring our lens to an even broader perspective and invite Professor Repnikova to talk about global China.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It was already really fascinating and insightful to listen to the first three presenters. My comments are going to address more of a global China angle, in particular, the narratives of China's influence operations and authoritarian model diffusion that are being popularized in the US policy discourse and are, I think, closely linked to this rising American Sinophobia, which I guess some would argue has never gone away. It's just kind of being reasserted in recent years. So I'm going to draw on some of the research that I've been carrying out on my current book project that looks at China's soft power approaches towards Africa, and also how the US is treating this phenomenon and why it's so sensitive to China's influence and engagements on the African continent. And my empirical work is particularly focused on Ethiopia. But I'm going to draw on this kind of to make some broader points about why this discourse of influence operations is highly problematic. So first of all, in recent years, we're seeing this, I think, discussion about China-US relations moving beyond economic competition towards this arena of values and norms. And Christian already talked about this in terms of ideology and this kind of use of these ideological terms, of course, for kind of self-interest or political motives. But we're also seeing this kind of concept of morality coming up quite a bit in discussions of China and the US in the world. So, for example, Evan Osnos, the former bureau chief of the New Yorker in China, wrote an article in January that concluded with this phrase that we cannot really stop China from, changing, or we cannot bring it back to the past, but we should contest China's moral vision of the future, as he puts it. So there's this kind of sense that, all we can do is look towards the future and have this moral engagement or competition, contestation that's highly necessary. And again, that's coming from liberal thinkers, not just the right? This is kind of a cross spectrum. And there's this kind of explicit and arguably fear-driven concern of the US policy community that China presents a threat to democracy, not only here in the US, but also globally, all around the world, and particularly in the developing world, where it's becoming more and more influential economically. And this rise of terms like influence operations and authoritarian model diffusion have become kind of the key terms to describe what's happening, what China is engaged in. And these narratives have already translated into policy. Some of these, I think Keisha also already alluded to this notion of restricting scientists, right, from practicing in their work in China, but also, of course, the pressure to close down Confucius institutes, which many of them have already shut down in the United States, as well as limiting, access for Chinese students to study in the US, limiting all forms of intellectual collaboration, and more recently also transferring much of the funding from the Defense Department from terrorism kind of operations and tackling insurgencies towards competing with China and Russia. So there's this kind of sense of great power competition. It's not just narratives, it's also where the money is going, the funding of the government. And the Defense Department, which is one of the most funded parts of the government, is tackling this issue, or supposed to tackle it head on through its various programs. So I'm going to focus specifically on kind of China's cultural and educational engagements, because that's what I'm most interested in. And I think those fall under those influence operations in this narrative. And also, as I mentioned, they tend to be kind of addressed in policy discourses and framings as well. So I would argue that while China's cultural and education engagements in the US and globally call for more rigorous empirical examination as well as policy realignments, these terms are highly problematic, and they are really kind of preventing us from better assessing, understanding China's global engagements, but also from competing with China if that's the aim of the US government. So there's lack of assessment, proper assessment, but also I think very weak competition if that's the aim. So there's no really constructive kind of use of those terms. And I want to explain why these terms are so problematic. First, why are they unhelpful? So first of all, I think this concept of influence, kind of influence operations and authoritarian model diffusion, they tend to conflate the presence of Chinese funding with the party's intent to control and indoctrinate. So this idea that as long as the money comes from the party state, the aim is to indoctrinate, whoever the recipients are. So in reality, many countries spend money, right? Governments spend money on public diplomacy in a similar way that China does, including the US, spending money on Voice of America and various public diplomacy operations, but that's considered to be soft power. So from what we imply from this concept is that authoritarian regimes, or China in particular, does not have the right to practice soft power. It just doesn't have the right to be engaged in this activity. So anything that Chinese government does, sponsors, is immediately understood as sharp power, influence operations, or kind of a malign activity. There's no right for them to be practicing anything else. As Susan Shirk noted in her dissenting opinion to the Hoover report on this issue, that's conflating this kind of illicit and ordinary activity of China overseas actually overstates the threat of China. It's really counterproductive because it conflates everything together, and it doesn't really help us to understand what's illicit and what's not. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that these slogans and accusations tend to treat China as a monolithic actor, ignoring the multiplicity of claims and motivations driving different Chinese actors who take part in this kind of global image promotion. And that's something I'm looking at more closely, is how Chinese initiatives implemented, what are the different actors thinking about it. So to give you an example, for example, of teachers, right? Chinese teachers who are part of Confucius Institutes, not only my own work, but also the work of, I think, Hubbard on Confucius Institutes in the US has shown that teachers have multiple motivations for coming to the United States, but also around the world that are really not very linked, not directly linked or even directly linked to politics. Most of them are interested in learning English better, practicing the professional skills, sending their kids to American schools, and some of them are even interested in staying in the United States. An example from Ethiopia, where I was looking at CIs across the country, there's teachers coming in to practice their skills of teaching Chinese language overseas as a stepping stone to then come to the US. So the US is still the final destination. So in a sense, these teachers are wanting to enter the Western-centric global order and practice their skills here to kind of sharpen them and to remain here, to be part of it, as opposed to oppose it and to ideologically brainwash the students. That there's no evidence for that so far. If we look at Chinese companies that export surveillance equipment, that's another big claim, that there's this digital surveillance export. Those companies are primarily, I would argue, market driven. They want to make money. So they're selling their technologies around the world wherever they see the market for these products, as opposed to having a centralized plan that's being, again, kind of propagated and instituted by the party state to sell technology everywhere, to empower this huge kind of a plan of digital authoritarianism. That's, again, there's no empirical evidence for that, but that's how a lot of the arguments are being built. There's a top-down plan, but in reality, various actors are pursuing their own interests. The third problem is that the scale of Chinese activities, or how much they're doing, is conflated with the effects. So oftentimes we hear such things as the numbers of, trainings, for instance, of elite officials from Africa are very high, and therefore China is ideologically influencing these officials. Or there are over 500 Confucius Institutes now in the world, which is, again, evidence of China's ideological kind of warfare. The numbers don't indicate influence, right? The numbers are just showing us the ambition of Chinese party state to improve its image, and potentially there could be also some maybe negative activities that are being carried out on the side, but I think overall the numbers don't indicate ideological success of influence or even intent. So that's another way in which I think this discourse is conflating some really important points. And lastly, I think this narrative of influence operations really ignores and kind of underplays the agency of targets of Chinese cultural programs, of the actual audience who is receiving these programs, who are participating in them. That the fact that they are not able to withstand this kind of efforts, even if they do exist, we would argue that, perhaps I would argue they don't, but to this extent, but even if they do, then what's the role of the target audiences? Are they not able to withstand or critically reflect on some of these Chinese ambitions and activities? I would say that they're certainly able to. Again, turning to Hubbard's work on CIs, she shows that the students are going into these institutes in high schools because they want to learn Chinese, but also because they want to put Chinese in their CVs. It's a CV booster. It's a very practical reason for being there. And they're also coming out of this program as more critical and self-reflective about China and their relationship with China. And when they go on trips sponsored by China, they come out of it more kind of suspicious and critical about propaganda, and they try to kind of understand what China is up to, as opposed to being brainwashed, so to speak, and kind of unable to discern truth from facts or have any critical opinions. Students in Ethiopia enter CIs because they want jobs at Chinese companies. So they're able to simultaneously hold opinions of, benefiting from Chinese enterprises and companies and cultural initiatives, as well as free trips, but also to be critical of what China is doing domestically, or how it treats, African counterparts, or how it doesn't address the issue of race and racial biases and discrimination. So they're able to hold all those multifaceted opinions at once, of course, and to balance them out and to negotiate them to their advantage whenever they have a situation that's apt for critiquing China, they will, and when they have a situation that can benefit from China, they will as well. So the audience is very agile and I think reflective in many ways. And I think that's really something that's missing and kind of being dismissed from this discourse of influence operations, suggested that the influence is kind of there and it's impossible to do anything about it. So I will conclude just on the point that I think beyond just not being, this discourse not being very helpful or kind of being in many ways misleading, it's also potentially quite dangerous. First of all, even though I think this narrative comes out of this rising xenophobia, it also, of course, inflames it, because the idea of influence operations and limits on Chinese professional scientists and students and intellectual exchange, it creates this climate that anybody could be a target, of course, of these operations. We're already seeing these investigations happening on campuses, FBI agents investigating faculty members who are collaborating with China, Chinese students unable to come, worried about their visas. All of that, I think, from just the lack of access to the way they're treated on the ground, to fears of how they will be treated, is really, it's very dangerous and very unfortunate. So I think that's one really significant kind of implication. But the other one is also that the US itself is kind of limiting its own understanding of China as a result, because we're training fewer professionals who are able to understand, to engage with China. We're limiting intellectual and cultural exchange, not only by shutting down this Chinese kind of activities and initiatives, but also because of shutting them down, China is also very sensitive, of course, to us coming over there and researching and carrying out our scholarship and exchange. So now it's becoming more and more difficult to carry out any kind of dialogue. And I think that's a really big weakness and shortcoming of this discourse. And I think globally, this kind of narrative of, whether it's debt trap diplomacy or influence operations or authoritarian model export, it's dangerous because it inflames ideological competition with China. China is forced to respond. So even though I would argue Chinese government hasn't used a whole lot of ideological narrative about its global engagements, even the word Chinese model hasn't been used that much. They're kind of trying to abstain from that term. When the US provokes China to respond, they will, and they're starting to respond and use that language more readily because of the United States. So in a sense, they're kind of tied into this game of provocations, which is, again, not constructive in any way. And I think, lastly, it puts pressure on many developing countries to choose between China and the United States, or to at least kind of symbolically highlight their alliances. And that's not really to the benefit of these countries. These officials and students and various actors engaging with China, they want to engage with both. They want to be able to choose offerings from various states, whether it's in terms of culture, education, or economic deals. Nobody wants to choose sides. And I think that's something that the US wants some countries to do, but that's not what their intent is. So I think that's really kind of not benefiting these countries that the US is trying to win over. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. This is again, an important perspective, right? That we looked at the internal to the US, right? We looked at our historical legacy of xenophobia. We looked at how it manifests concurrently right now in political world. And thank you, Maria, for bringing it to the global perspective. And I'd like to welcome our final panelist, Professor Catherine Liu. You might have noticed that we didn't get to introduce you in person in the beginning. She managed to join us now. So Professor Catherine Liu is a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine, and today she'll be talking about Cold War comparative literature. So floor is yours, Professor Liu. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I talk about Cold War and the formation of comparative literature as a kind of anti-communist, anti-Marxist, anti-socialist front in America's attempts to win hearts and minds, Keisha's paper reminded me of something that I witnessed firsthand last summer. I went up to the Eastern Sierras where the gold rush had left, sort of old ghost towns, and we went hiking there. And I went and we saw the town hall and the town prison of this town named Bridgeport, where a Chinese man had been lynched in about 15 years before your wedding of the coon and the Chinese, which really resonated with me, because the thing is that first it made me realize, like, this is why Chinese people don't come and hike in the Eastern Sierras, and I'm the only person there. And then second, it was that this lynching really assimilated, like, the Chinese man with the African American, because this is in a few years after Reconstruction, America is at the height of its racial hysteria, and Kwong, his name is commemorated by a plaque, but he was suspected of cannibalism and acquitted. Yeah, he was suspected of eating a Native American poker player named Poker Pete. And so he was acquitted by the court. And as he was released, it's like a To Kill a Mockingbird scene, but with the same bad ending. A mob was there, waited for him, and lynched him. So, but that's a preamble to this story about how Americans racialize the other by imagining this kind of like cannibalism. And in the 20th century, we imagine the communist other, and especially the Chinese communist other, as sort of aberrationally submissive or susceptible to propaganda. And also now with China's rise economically, we imagine this communist socialist other as someone who's simply, as a country that's rapacious and hegemonic. When we all know that America is the original imperialist in the 20th century, but it's China's 21st century imperialism that everyone has to worry about. Now, so this takes me back to what the topic of my talk was going to be, which was that the very formulation of the study of comparative literature within the United States was to promote an approach to culture that was non-ideological. So the Soviet Union and China were ideological, they were aberrational, and you could say also like propagandistic, brainwashing, and also, you know, this goes back to my Kwang story, like somewhat cannibalistic in its relationship to eating and the other, and so non-human, or, you know, at the edge of being human. But the thing that I really wanted to focus on is this anti-Chinese sentiment that's sort of reprising a lot of Cold War and racist imagery actually was promoted during the height of the Obama administration by in literary studies, because I come out of the humanities, and this is probably something that you guys don't know or even really care about, but it was promoted in the height of the Obama years by an attempt by China, Taiwanese scholars and Hong Kong scholars like Ray Chow and Xu Meishi to promote Sinophone studies as opposed to Chinese studies, to actually just take away the notion, the name China from the from East Asian studies, because they said China was too established. China was nationalistic. China studies ascribes to a kind of official culture. And I'm going to share my screen for just 1 second so that you can see a copy of Xu Meishi's article in the publication of the Modern Languages Association, which is like the premier publication of literary studies in the United States. So I'm just going to read to you what in 2012, I would say this is high Obamaism, high liberal pluralism. America has won the war of ideas because we've elected an African-American president, and, you know, liberalism has taken us past racism and nationalism as well as socialism. So what Xu Meishi writes in this article is, you know, something about how Chineseness is hegemonic and homogenizing. There are multifarious margins in China, which are not taken, which are, you know, oppressed by China-centrism. And we are simply not hard enough on China. This is the discourse now of both Republican and Democratic parties. And she says, because there is lingering leftist romanticism about socialist China in the United States, along with the political and economic need of the hyper-capitalist state to appease China. And this has dealt this tradition of looking at China's ideological censorship as oppressive kind of moot, because we have on the one hand leftist romanticist and then hyper-capitalist appeasement of Chinese growth. And so what Shi is arguing for in this article is a kind of hardness on China, which would mean to take the Chinese name out of China studies and Chinese literary studies and call the study of Chinese culture and literature and film Sinophone studies. So that displacement in 2012, I think, is really important. It's at a moment of liberal triumphalism of America's own, and Xu Meishi wants Sinophone studies to be organized like American ethnic studies. So you have different ethnicities like Malaysian Chinese and Indonesian Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese. They all fall under Sinophone studies because China itself as a nation for her is simply backward and nationalistic. It reflects, China's borders reflect Qing dynasty, imperialism. And so to blow up China centrism, she wants us to substitute Sinophone studies. Her power in the field is really intense. And I asked Christian, like, do you want me to come and talk to you today? Because she's going to be aren't you going to alienate a lot of your colleagues? Because Xu Meishi is going to be the president of the American Association of Comparative Literature. And she has a lot of power within East Asian studies. So institutionally, this is her message is something that liberal private foundations really like to hear too, because what it promotes is this idea that academics are cosmopolitan, anti-nationalistic. America is anti-ideological, in fact. And you have this, the site of ideology, this is back in the Cold War days again, the site of ideology, the site of a kind of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism is China. The only thing that I wanted to, and you know, Xi Jinping is a very, you know, authoritarian leader. But as Maria pointed out, the struggles within the CCP to define what are correct paths to take right now in terms of economic development, in terms of central planning, in terms of foreign policy, those struggles are real. But once you paint China with this single brush, and the Republicans and the Democrats are doing it, and you say, we're not hard enough on China, you can no longer see that complexity. You can no longer see the various strains of political struggle and legitimacy that are happening right now. And in fact, one of the things that's happened in China that I think is really interesting is that Peking University students of the far left began to organize Marxist reading groups, Maoist reading groups, and workers in the Pearl River Delta, and they were broken up. So in fact, there's an anti-socialist, anti-union, anti-organizing movement within the CCP, but there is a movement of, I wouldn't call them hyper-leftists, I would just say leftists within China to contest the economic order there. So none of those things are being seen. And as Maria said, you know, this actually makes America uniquely incapable of dealing with China. But what it does is it returns us to a Cold War paradigm where we have this terrifying other, and it's not Russia now, it's not the Soviet Union now, it's actually a racialized other with an excessive appetite for territory, for money, etc., that needs to be contained. And so there's a softening up of any idea that there can be a diplomatic coexistence with China. We're softening up that idea and priming us up for war, for a hot war. One of the things that I was doing some research on too was American attitudes toward Taiwan right now, because Taiwan has been a model of handling COVID-19. Now, what you'll see in centrist foundation think tanks, from Brookings to Hoover, far-right foundations, you'll see an attitude that promotes Taiwan as this model of a liberal democracy versus, you know, PRC as, you know, ideological, oppressive, authoritarian, communist, etc. But what all of the studies neglect, what all of the commentary on the Taiwanese handling of COVID neglect, is that Taiwan has national healthcare system. And what they also neglect to say is that because of COVID-19, the PRC is about to institute national healthcare. The national healthcare was a crisis of enormous proportions in China after the Deng reform years. It's one of the reasons why there was such a powerful household savings, excessive household savings, which, you know, made Chinese consumers less apt to consume, because there was no reorganized transition from the commune organizations of the pre-Deng era to the post-development era. So every family was like, what if my mother gets sick? What if I get sick? I have to like save every extra penny I make because there is no social safety net now. So, but what Taiwan did in 1987 was institute one of the most advanced, progressive, social democratic institute, national healthcare systems. They studied NHS in England. They studied the Canadian national healthcare system, and everyone agrees, like epidemiologists, public health scholars agree, that it's because of national healthcare that Taiwan was able to contain the virus. But because most private foundations and foreign policy analysts hate the idea of social democracy, they will not mention that as part of Taiwan's infrastructural support, and they will promote this idea of Taiwan as a kind of liberal democracy, and that's why they were able to defeat the virus, which is not just like absolute. Taiwan is a liberal democracy, but it's not because of that they contained the virus. It's because of a really powerful NHI and concerted, centralized response, which is something that, you know, libertarians and Americans hate. and a national contact tracing national database system that was based on their NHI. So one of the things that I'm really afraid of is that this Cold War will eventually become a hot war in a very localized manner, because there's a way in which the characterization of China as this rapacious, inhuman force and this neo-imperialist force is being prepared by both liberal hawks and neocons. So we have to reject both sides of that, and we have to reject also this liberal idea that somehow academics can rise above nationalism and be cosmopolitan, and we give all of like aberrant nationalism to China. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you, Professor Liu. And actually, we have a few questions coming in, so I encourage audience members, do submit your questions. Our most recent question that came in, actually, Professor Liu, builds on your discussion of the global comparison of COVID responses. And this question is actually directed at all the panelists. I'm going to read it out loud so that audience members can see it. But this audience member wonders how each of you panelists are thinking about arguments that explain China's relative success in containing the coronavirus by making reference to stereotypes, to that submissiveness, credulousness, to explain that societal compliance with government directives. This audience member finds, right, that people do have arguments that's intended to critique, right, American COVID responses, that they kind of end up use the same assumptions about Chinese people as explicitly xenophobic and pro-American arguments. I'm curious, how do you see this current COVID response, both on a local scale, but also on a policy scale, as reflecting some of the themes that we talked about today?
Well, I'll just start because I think my response would be short. I think you do see that, and I think some of those tropes are deployed when South Korea's success, for example, is mentioned, or as Catherine said, Taiwan. And so in that case, we have these countries with different political systems, and then there's a retreat to a notion of some kind of East Asian, hive mind sort of thing. Oh, well, they're different, they'll wear masks and stuff. And I think that's self-defeating, because I think these policies are adoptable by anyone. It's quite clear why they're successful, and there's no reason that those policies can't be adopted. And so if we say, oh, it's a different culture, then again, we foreclose on the possibility of gaining from that experience.
Yeah, and I think that's really easy way to dismiss like the collective, the East Asian collective thing. But there was one policy that the Taiwanese government imposed right away, and that was adopted in Wuhan, actually, and the PRC did similar things, but it was very streamlined in Taiwan, which was that if you were a working class person who either tested positive, had symptoms, or was afraid that you had symptoms, you were immediately asked to quarantine at home. And because you had an NHI card, you could, they could ask you, they knew where you were. But the government came and delivered food to all of these people, and they had a $300 Taiwan dollars supplement a day for lost wages, and they imposed that immediately. And we could have done that. We could do that. The other thing that the Taiwanese government did was that, and this is also because the government had a picture of Google searches in the country in January, when the first rumors of the Wuhan outbreaks were, sort of traveling over the straits, and there was a rush on masks, and people started buying out masks. When they saw those Google searches and searching for conspiracy theories, the government said NHI would provide free masks at pharmacies and doctors' clinics right away. Stop the conspiracy theories, stop the Google searches almost immediately, and they came out with a coherent public statement about mask wearing. Like, that's not cultural. That's infrastructure. That's like efficient government or something. That's technocratic. It's socialist because the masks were free. And I think that's really important too. Like they were providing those so that people wouldn't panic buy. and hoard them.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from fellow panelists? If not, I have another question that just came through. This person wanted to know, how do you think, right, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism is still useful today, or not useful, right, to explain this US-China transnational relationship? And if so, you know, where have you seen it, you know, manifest itself right now? And if not, like, what are the other useful theoretical frameworks that we could use, maybe, you know, beyond the theory of soft power?
Can I say something? I don't think it's useful. I think Said's notion of Orientalism was very focused on France and the Middle East. And I think that people forget that, like, really important context. We just use Orientalism all the time. So that's my...
Mm-hmm. Kristen, were you like trying to unmute yourself? I wasn't sure if you were zooming close to. Another question that came through was inviting you to think about, I mean, each of you, right? And that's really to all of you. How did you read this week's vice presidential debate? And how are the themes that each of you talked about? I think each of you really touched on things that could be applicable about how these messages, right, these frameworks were used in the debate.
I'll start with this. And I was just because I remember I had to go back and look at kind of the questions they were asking. And the one question they asked both VPs was, is China a competitor, an adversary, or an enemy? And it's like, okay, so we have three categories. And what does that mean? And neither one of those puts anything in a positive spin. It doesn't say collaboration, doesn't say are we allies. It's very much competitor. So there's competition probably on the economic front. Adversary or enemy, like there's nothing positive in that choice. So the question itself was leading. I think for me, I was actually watching my students, had to kind of mute my face because I don't want y'all to see what I'm thinking. And I was texting my colleagues, especially when the phrase economic surrender to China was mentioned over and over and over. And there was no context, there was no real discussion about US-China relations on any front as we think about what's happening right now. And so for me, as a response, I had to put in the chats that I was talking with, like, here's what we need to think about US-China. And I had to give them some other kind of critical questions, because the way they framed it was, you know, they framed it in a way where we already think about China in this kind of negative adversarial way. But what is the level of our competition? What is it? Is it just, you know, competition, or is it something worse? So for me, the question itself was frustrating. Pence didn't answer at all. Kamala sort of answered, but not really. That was one of her weakest moments in thinking about foreign policy. And I was very concerned because I know, thinking through what I do in my own work, you know, thinking through on the academic front, you know, how what's happening between US-China relations is impacting negatively in the academic space. I know the other spaces are feeling it too, but I know for me personally, how this has been where, you know, scholars can't go to China and Chinese scholars can come here. It's a reduction of, we have the Fulbright program to China, Hong Kong being dismissed, where you have lack of a creation of more knowledge because people are in some ways this fear of the China other, and it's become this easy scapegoat. And neither one of the other side in some ways address that. And so I was trying to make sure for my students, I gave them a lot of reading material to say, this is how we should think about this in more critical ways, because it's used the way they framed it was a very negative framework. And we need to move beyond kind of a one-sided approach to kind of support the ways in which some of the mainstream politics are trying to frame China. So for me, the way I was just very frustrated. And my family can tell you, and I was tweeting, they were like, it's okay, Keisha, just breathe. But it was just very frustrating to hear how they were framing the question and addressing it in a way that was not critical. And if the people who are watching at home are not people who in some ways think about China at all, or they don't know someone who they can talk to and think about these questions with, it paints a picture that can be so misleading, especially to how we think about the ways in which they, you know, reach out to certain demographics and how they might not know that there's another way to think about China. So I was very, I was frustrated a little bit. I'm hoping it'll be better, but I'm not sure if that will happen between now and the election in November.
Right. That was excellent. I also feel constantly frustrated. I'm going to slightly deflect the question and just mention the fact that everybody's fascination and joy with the fly landing on Mike Pence's head is really indicative of the fact that everybody knows that the discourse itself is, they're not really going to learn anything from it, or that people aren't going to answer the questions, as Keisha just mentioned. And so the fly actually stands in for this, right, embodiment of a kind of enjoyment, and that, and people's also frustration with the level of discourse. So where I'm going to deflect the question slightly is not the debate of the vice presidents, but I'm going to go back to March. With the last debate between Bernie and Biden. And if we recall this debate, Bernie was trying to simply argue that China has done some things that are good for its people, right? And if you recall, Biden said, "Would you praise Jack the Ripper?" And then was cut off. There's a transcript of all the debates. Just go back to the last debate between Biden and Bernie. And this comes out of, again, Biden accusing Bernie of saying some positive things about Cuba's socialist healthcare system, right? So in other words, that and so here again, so what I'm really what I care about a lot is trying to reframe and shift the discourse, right? So if the discourse, if what we take as the center is actually to the right, then move the goddamn center, pardon my language. But, you know, so the idea is, and again, this is not something partisan for Bernie, but what he was trying to do in that moment was to say, can we possibly open up the discourse in a way that isn't this dichotomous thing that Maria was also talking about? And I guess all of us were talking about, right? And immediately it was shut down, China, Jack the Ripper, butcher, whatever, you know, these congeries of images. So that was a lost moment. And that was also the same debate, to go back to my comments, over the coronavirus, where Bernie said this is the moment we need to actually rethink, you know, our healthcare system and our economic system. And Biden said, how dare you, Americans just want normal. And so we can see how those discourses are actually very much related to each other. So that was a missed opportunity to say something new.
Just to add to that, I think there's just, even though I'm frustrated with the way these debates go as well, I think there's no space for much of a thoughtful or alternative way of kind of thinking about China, US, I mean, in a more constructive way, or even asking whether there is another way other than competition or adversarial relations. I just don't think that's politically advantageous to any party. At this point, China is a card, it's a political card to play during the election. And if somebody comes off as weak on China, they're just automatically kind of shamed and ridiculed and, you know, all of those things. So it doesn't seem like there's much room for this sort of discussion. So even though, you know, this is a debate level, but if we look at policymakers or even think tank communities, I think the problem with it is that the ideological narrative is spreading everywhere. It's not just this kind of top leadership positions, it's also the business community and think tank community and even some academic communities. So I think that's becoming kind of a much broader space. And I wonder how we're ever going to be able to tackle that and kind of swim out of this narrative into more complex and more interesting discussions in the future.
I have another question that comes, you know, on the heels of this, you know, the urge that we need more complex analysis of things. Here's a question. How does anti-communist or anti-China sentiment contribute to the perceptions and media narratives of the Uyghur Muslim conflict in Xinjiang? And how can we differentiate propaganda and misinformation from, you know, good, honest journalism to analyze these situations in a more critical way? Anyone want to take that? Go for it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's very important that we learn how to parse facts from the political narratives in which they're embedded. And just because the facts are instrumentalized doesn't mean that they're manipulated or made up. So what's happening in Xinjiang is very real and absolutely horrific, even if it has become a talking point of US military hawks. It is also important to point out the uncomfortable realities that are left out of the narrative coming from Congress, like how Bush's so-called ghastly war on terror provided the initial justification and rhetoric for the CCP, who understood and framed what they were doing in Xinjiang as an extension of the global fight against terrorism. The reference to Uyghurs as terrorists only enters official CCP discourse exactly 1 month after 9/11. What is also left out is how the CCP has actually studied US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Israeli tactics of counterinsurgency, such as the quote unquote human terrain system, which was developed by the US. Now, I want to be very clear that I'm not blaming the US for China's actions here. But what the CCP is 100% responsible for the brutal policies of taking Uyghurs from their families, placing them in camps euphemistically labeled vocational centers, and attempting to eradicate their religious beliefs and turning parts of Xinjiang into open-air prisons and security state. But what I am doing is questioning the moral and political grounds of US politicians who care, who pretend that they care about the plight of Uyghurs, and who pretend that they care about Islamophobia in China. If they did, they would also address it in US society. If they did, they would also address what India is doing in Kashmir and how Modi's regime has been fanning the flames of Hindu nationalism, recently kicked out Amnesty International, and more. But you don't see an India task force. Of course, the reason is that it was never about Muslims or human rights violation, but about the US's collective obsession with China and the role that anti-communism plays in propping up a wobbly US democracy. So recognizing the political mendacity of US politicians does not mean denying what is happening in Xinjiang, as unfortunately some on the left have done. It's a ridiculous thing, but I say we're capable enough of walking and chewing gum at the same time. You can be against the US, as Catherine is arguing, how the US is gearing up for a hot war, while you can absolutely reject and refuse that while simultaneously acknowledging what is happening in Xinjiang. If anybody is interested in learning more, I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion. I would recommend the online journal Made in China, who is a sponsor of the event, and especially of the work of good colleagues and comrades like Darren Byler, as well as David Brophy and others. Okay, that was the plug for Made in China. But anyway, so I just want to insist that we need to be much more complex in our ability to engage these things.
Thank you, Christian. I have a few questions that are actually all asking for Professor Liu, if you can speak a little bit more to your comments on Sinophone studies, that, recognizing that there are different perspectives on it, but I think folks are just curious about the many different takes on it. If you can speak more to that, thank you.
Okay, so I'm teaching a course called Sinophone Film Cinema right now. So it's not like I reject the term. I think it is a useful term. I think that it is not a term that should be promoted to erase China studies or the word China from academic fields, which is, I think, behind Shumisha's polemics to a certain degree, and I'll defend my point on that. And then someone asked, what about the diaspora in Sinophone studies? And one of the things that Shumisha says is that the Chinese government makes too much of overseas Chinese, and the diaspora a diaspora that's been outside of China for 3 generations is no longer a diaspora. And she wants to negate the idea of a Chinese diaspora because she says that the CCP calls up Chinese people or people of Han origin. They call them overseas Chinese, Huaqiao. And she wants to reject that. She wants to reject the use of the diasporic word. And so I find it this kind of liberal, pluralist, formalist, Saidian, worldly, cosmopolitan, complete point of view against what she believes is this kind of primitive nationalism of the CCP, and that socialism is yesterday's news, and we have to move on in 2012 to this kind of liberal utopia, which gave us Trump actually. So I'm not against Sinophone studies. I just feel like we have to look at institutional history, intellectual history, to understand why that term becomes so important. And it also implies a kind of pluralism where all of these different ethnicities can live together. And it is anti-class analysis, because difference then is only about ethnic difference, not about working class solidarity or working class versus bourgeoisie warfare, which is basically what we have now in the States, except that the elites are winning and they've promoted a billionaire populist to more thoroughly defeat the American working class.
Thank you. Any other, and any panelists want to chime in on this? Yep. I actually have here another question theme, right, that surfaced a few times over here and asked from some of our international students as well as domestic students, right? The question, and I'm trying to paraphrase multiple questions together, but the idea that, you know, as students, right, that they are, for international folks, they might be frustrated with the state-sanctioned violence, censorship within the PRC, and then also frustrated, you know, and for those who are not tied to the PRC, also frustrated with the liberal, conservative, xenophobic discourse, but also very compartmentalized identity-based struggles of, you know, xenophobia, Black Lives Matter, indigenous liberation, sovereignty, and other, you know, anti-oppression movements. And so I think the question for all of you is, where do you see these different movements and at the current point, you know, intersecting with each other? And how might we go, you know, with all these different boundaries of the different movements, as Dr. Brown said, engage in alternative solidarity or more integrative solidarity across these different racial and national lines? So any advice for our, you know, students who will be running the world?
I think Keisha should go for it.
I guess I was writing notes. I'm sorry. But the big question is like this, like, are you going to say something? So I guess it's my turn. I was writing notes, sorry. So I guess for me, one of the more kind of hopeful moments is that I recently had a chance to work with two grad students in China, and they were working on a project themselves about issues of race and difference in China, where they were talking about putting together a project for their communications course of how do we talk about what it means to be Black in China. And so this is a project they initiated, they did themselves, and they asked me for some support and resources, but it was very much their project. And I mention that to say, it is a moment where we see these different movements, these different groups are coming together on their own. And we think about the students themselves, where they are engaging in these questions because they want to know. And many students, they have been in some ways, they're not in some ways, they're raised in different environments where they are thinking through, excuse me, and thinking about the ways that they can think about their peers, the global community. They're thinking about this as well because this is in some ways the environment they've been raised in. And so while some of the boundaries that we know as our boundaries in terms of identity have been very much in some ways, we're trying to move beyond those, many students are thinking through like, why can't I ask these questions? Why can I engage in these conversations? Because this is important to me, because this is the world I actually want to see. And so I think in thinking through the idea of intersections of different movements, as I mentioned before, thinking through not necessarily the different individual struggles, but think about not just that, but also the ways in which these various systems of oppression in some ways navigate and manifest themselves, and thinking through how do we name it, how do we claim it, how do we dismantle it that way? Because one of the ways I've noticed in some of my discussions with some of my students and others is that they want to in some ways put it all together as one big blob. And it's like, well, you can't do anything about that if you don't know what you're talking about in terms of what is the specifics of it. So for instance, some of my students come in their freshman year, I think by the end of their freshman year, they're probably like, I'm so tired of this woman. But I also tell them, no, don't use the word the man in my classroom. I don't know first what that means. Second of all, it's very sexist. Who is this man that's oppressing you? I don't know what that means. It's very vague. And thinking through and having them, well, we have a whole conversation every course, every semester. We talk about oppression and different manifestations of it. And we start with the question, we talk about the different ways in which we talk about colonialism as well, and different manifestations and different levels of it, and how we still see that today. And so I think if we think about the ideas of what oppression is, what it does, who's impacted by it, that's a better kind of starting place to think about. It's impacting you in different ways, and here's how. So for sometimes for my students, it's, well, we have the model minority myth, we have the Asian model minority myth, and how that can be seen as both benefiting, but in some ways it's also very restricting, because what if you are in some ways in that category and you're not seen as this model minority, whatever that may mean? And if you're not in my model minority, what does that mean for you in terms of how you're seeing your particular institution? And so for me, it's a matter of thinking through these different ways in which it's manifested and building coalition on that. I think I've mentioned this before in another talk, but I think for me, one of the most other than optimistic moments was that when I was on fellowship at Emory, and I had a one-year fellowship down there, and I had students who, they on their own, the two different organizations, the African American Student Union and the Asian American Pacific Islander student groups, they wanted to come together to talk about conversations of racism, whether it's anti-Blackness or anti-Asian racism. And this was 2 years ago, before a lot of what's happening now. And the idea that they want to engage in these conversations. And I think for us, it's a matter of how can we be there to facilitate those and thinking through on the student level, what do you want to do? What are you willing to do? Are you willing to do the learning, to knowledge, to build that? And then how you can take that as well. And so I think for me, another kind of one example is the students who both at Harvard and Yale, who wrote letters in some ways thinking through how do we think about these generational discussions about how we think about understand other Americans and how we think about the ways in which we've been indoctrinated and how we could put sometimes thinking through the immigrant narrative, how we think about that kind of narrative and combining it and thinking through it and engaging with how we're also taught about African Americans, this idea of this kind of hierarchy in America where your goal is to come to America, buy into the American dream, and that dream in some ways means moving away from Black Americans. The idea is that we're at the bottom, move away from that bottom quote unquote level to move towards and assimilate more towards white American ideals. And so I think there's a lot of questioning on students on their behalf, but they're thinking through the ideas and things they've been told and thinking for themselves, and they want to engage in these conversations. So I'm focusing on students because that's what I deal with most often, but I want to think about and engage those conversations. But I pass it over to, I think Catherine has something she wants to add as well.
Oh, I wanted to add something, yeah, to Keisha's idea. I mean, this is a project that I've always wanted, like when I have time, I really want to work with people on this. But I was thinking a lot a couple of years ago about the migration from city to country, from rural to urban environments, the migrant worker plight, especially from 2011 to now. And I was actually thinking a model for looking at masses of people who are displaced economically, who move to cities, is actually the African American Great Migration as well, from the South to the industrial Northeast and Midwest. The movement from the trauma of moving from a rural agricultural village in China is one thing, but from to urban industrial labor is one thing, but the trauma of African Americans leaving the plantation, moving to industrial jobs in the North and the Midwest is a similar kind of population displacement forced by economic issues. I think that's the site of a lot of profound transnational, transracial solidarity, working class solidarity, to understand what happened in that rural urban migration. And that's what we should be focusing on. Why aren't private foundations funding this kind of study? Because this does not serve the purposes of capital. And I'm going to sound like an old school Marxist. These kinds of projects should be funded, they should be studied. African American students should go to China to study that. Chinese students should come here. This is what Mellon should be funding. Instead of all of these like anti-bias training things, these two things shaped America, shaped China, these two massive migrations. And it's like such a striking commonality. It's profound. And then what happens to populations deracinated from the countryside who have to live in these cities where in China you don't have hukou, but in America, you don't have your agrarian traditions anymore. You're displaced from your family. A lot of the African-American families fall apart when they move from the rural to the urban, and same things happening in China right now. I'm like, let's look at like actual historical, sociological, economic things that have happened to the Chinese working class that were presaged by what happened to the African-American working class. That's what happened in capitalism. It's a development, urbanization, industrialization that took this agrarian population, shaped it for its purposes, and then threw it out.
And I would add maybe one more test site would be maybe Los Angeles. A lot of individuals move West Coast.
Yeah, a lot of them moved to Los Angeles too.
And Los Angeles would be a very interesting case study.
Yeah, they worked in the Cold War industries. They worked in aerospace. They had factory jobs, right?
Yeah, that's how my relatives got to California. I have a whole people out there. So I mean, it's
there's a huge populations very close to me. Yeah,
like, this is what we
need to study. This is what we need to study.
Kristen, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I this is amazing, and I don't really have anything to add other than outside of the sites of the university, also consider joining your local Democratic Socialists of America chapter, or a different kind of party organization that's multi-tendency, multiracial, and that is anti-capitalist. So my thinking has changed over time, and I don't think that that race can be collapsed into a reductionist economic Marxism, but you also can't jettison the Marxism either. You also can't jettison the class. So I would think about holding these two things together, because look, if capitalism is destroying the environment and we're on a sinking ship, there's no point in diversifying it, right? So in other words, we need to think about how to intervene in the structures that that both takes a anti-racist as well as anti-capitalist thinking.
And I guess I want to add on to that. I think that's one of the points. I think that's one of the reasons why when Mao was trying to reach out to African Americans, it collapsed, because he was putting one person on the other, where it says racism as a byproduct of capitalism, and not realizing how capitalism and race work together. And one example is thinking about how you have racially divided unions. And I think we're still having that same conversation. Look at the Communist Party in the USA, doing those same things. So how do we, in some ways, hold those two in tandem in a way that where we're not breaking down to kind of struggle Olympics, if you will. My struggle is this and that. How do we hold those conversations in tandem and thinking through those, and then add other dimensions to it in terms of gender, sexuality, and in other words, how do we build this kind of multi-identity, multilateral collaboration? And I think that's still something we're thinking through today. But what are some models? And then we have a lot of models of what doesn't work, but then we have some models of what does work.
Right. Wow, this is mountain time, 3:34 already. We are a few minutes over, and I know some of you attendees need to head to other places. So I do want to wrap us up now. I think we realistically need another 4 hours today. We kind of just got warmed up now, right? We need to get our coffee and then just sit and keep hanging out. But knowing that it's Friday afternoon, so I want to thank all the panelists, and also want to thank the staff. They are not showing as pictures on the screen, but they have made the technology and the captioning and everything work. So thank you, staff colleagues, for making this happen. And thank you, colleagues and friends from around the country. Thank you, audience, for coming. You have information on who we are. We're all associated with institutions, so look us up, email us. I'm sure we can continue more conversations, and I look forward to maybe further panels on this important topic. Everybody stay safe, have a good weekend, and thank you for coming.